Hello, everyone. This weekend I just finished listening to the book Our Time Is Now by Stacey Abrams, which is admittedly a different sort of book than what I've been talking about recently. The author Stacey Abrams was the Democratic Party candidate in the 2018 race for the governor of Georgia, and she narrowly missed election in a hotly contested race, but more on that in a minute. She's also the first Black woman to receive a major party nomination for governor in the history of the U.S. in any U.S. state. And coming from a family that witnessed the Jim Crow era voter suppression firsthand, the integrity and the openness of the voting process are clearly very important to Stacey Abrams. And that's really the main thesis of this book, which made it an ideal read for this time of the year right before voting day in the US, even though I honestly didn't actually plan for that when I picked it up. Now, before I go any further, I just want to say a disclaimer that this is, without debate, a political book. And I think it's always important to consider where an author comes from and how that influences what they have to say. Abrams is, as I mentioned, a member of the U.S. Democratic Party, and like anyone, her views are shaped by that and her other life experiences. And although I don't claim to be totally personally unbiased, and I agree with Abrams on many of her points, my goal in this short review isn't primarily to endorse her or to make a political statement. I just want to summarize the arguments she makes and what I took out of this read so that you can decide whether to read it and draw your own conclusions. I also hope to read more books in the future by political figures of all sorts of leanings, and not even just ones from the U.S., to understand what's important to different people. Okay, so like I said, Stacey Abrams ran for governor of Georgia in a hotly contested and often controversial 2018 election. The center of this controversy was around the idea of who could vote. Her opponent, Brian Kemp, was the Secretary of State in Georgia at the time of the election, a role responsible for ensuring the integrity of the election process. And critics, including Abrams, say that he should have recused himself from these duties since he was running for office himself. Abrams accused Kemp of using a variety of voter suppression tactics, which she outlines in the first half of this book. Still, although this election forms the backdrop for many of the events in this book, it's not exactly what this book is about specifically. The book is much broader in its scope. The book is more specifically about voting rights and voting engagement in the U.S. throughout history, up until this point, and in the future. She also, in my understanding, isn't exactly arguing against the outcome itself or claiming that she is the rightful governor of Georgia right now, despite her concerns that she expressed about the fairness of the election process. The way she tells it in the book, she still succeeded anyway by engaging more voters, including both Black and white voters, who hadn't voted in a very long time in Georgia, and who came out to vote in what was not a presidential election, which is the type of election that people in the United States more often tend to engage with. And the close results of this race were a testament to her efforts. So the first hour or two of this book in the audiobook form covered that topic of Stacey Abrams' race for governor. But from there, she segues into really the topic of the first half of the book, the history of voter suppression in the U.S. And one thing that was interesting that stood out to me from her account is that she talks about how throughout the second half of the 20th century, through legislation such as the Voting Rights Act and renewals by subsequent presidents from both parties up until really the end of the 20th century, she claims that although things weren't perfect, voter equality was moving in the right direction. Following the election of Barack Obama in 2008, this was a turning point and not one towards equality, because following this election, which saw record turnouts in voters of many minority groups, including Black voters, and an overall high turnout, she presents a case that Obama's opponents in the Republican Party then embarked on a new strategy of figuring out how to ensure that the people who turn up to vote are the people who are going to vote for their own party by any means necessary. Now, I was certainly familiar with the idea of voter suppression, particularly within the Jim Crow era, but also knew that it's still a hotly debated topic today. But what the first half of this book really does is using a variety of examples and evidence, including voting results and legislation across the different states. She talks about the history of voter suppression and the ways in which it still exists in the present. And these tactics, which she argues that the Republicans have been increasingly using since 2008, include supposedly missing registrations, as in you're a registered voter, but they say that there's some kind of problem with your existing registration. For example, you go up to vote and they see that there's a dash in your name and your ID has to match the voter registration perfectly, so you're not allowed to vote. There also have been voter purges, or the use it or lose it laws, as she calls them, which are claimed to be there to remove dead voters or people who no longer live in the country from voting. But the effective consequence of these voter purges is really just to remove a lot of people who are perfectly valid voters and just haven't voted in a while, maybe because they simply weren't able to get off of work. For example, she talks about the loss of voting rights as a penalty for a felony conviction, which often extends past actually being in prison and sometimes as much as the rest of your life, I think. She talks about allegations of voter fraud by the Republican Party, which are often used to justify things like voter purges and voter suppression. She argues that this concept of widespread voter fraud is largely debunked. It's extremely rare, and even an investigation by Donald Trump's own voter commission turned up no evidence that voter fraud was really a problem. And thus, the real fraud or problematic issue is preventing valid voters from voting. And I do think this is an important point because it makes sense to me that if policies are intended to curb voter fraud, but in effect are stripping more people of their voting rights, and these are rights, not privileges, under U.S. law, then zero tolerance policies for voter fraud will have the effect of essentially stripping more people of their rights than it actually catches committing voter fraud. After all, I mean, if there was no voting at all, then there would be no voter fraud. And yet I highly support the institution of voting and democracy. So I think that is something that we definitely need to consider. She further talks about how these voter fraud claims have led to stricter ID laws, which, again, penalize minority voters who are more likely to vote for the Democrats. The reason being it just can be more difficult for them to obtain an ID. And since their names are less widely recognized by white U.S. population, they're more likely to contain things like dashes, leading to further confusion about whether their registration is valid. She talks about how it can be hard to get to the voting booth itself. For example, voting precincts may be closed, which, of course, is a problem if people don't know about this and they used to vote in one precinct and then they show up and either they've been switched to a different precinct or that precinct no longer has a voting space. And it can be especially difficult for people with limited transportation because, if they show up at the end of the day to vote, they may not have time to go to whatever they're told is the correct place to vote. Sometimes people might have voted, but their vote might not be counted. A common one is actually an example that Stacey Abrams tells the story of how this almost happened when she was voting for herself. She went in to vote, and they told her that the records showed she had already voted by absentee ballot, which was not actually the case. And she said, well, I think I would remember voting for myself, so I'm pretty sure that's not true. But the actual candidate for governor had trouble voting for herself and had to basically get someone to follow up on this. And of course, they checked everything and straightened it up, and she was able to vote. But what often happens instead is they give you a provisional ballot. And as Abrams presents it in this book, provisional ballot is basically a piece of trash that you're writing your vote on, because she cites some statistics that are pretty alarming about states in which provisional ballots are actually rejected at a rate of 50 to 75%, which is kind of crazy. So she recommends not voting on a provisional ballot unless that is your only option. She talks about redistricting as a political strategy, or also the concept of gerrymandering, as in drawing district boundaries on the map that look a little bit like a salamander, with the goal of kind of grouping together opposition voters with enough supporting voters for your own party to outweigh the say of the opposition voters. And to Stacey Abrams' credit, she points out that some of these tactics, such as the gerrymandering, have been used to the advantage of both political parties in the past, but argues in present times these issues are predominantly and overwhelmingly used in support of the Republican Party. And also because she finds voting rights so important, she categorically opposes any voter suppression, regardless of which party it's used to support. Okay, so that first part is what I found to be the strongest part of the book. I learned a lot about it. Even though I'd heard of most of these concepts before, I didn't know about the total history of them. I didn't know how often they were used in recent history. And the examples that Stacey Abrams presents as evidence that these problems exist are quite credible, in my opinion. So she then talks a little bit about some recommendations for how to make things fairer, such as, for example, to avoid unfair redistricting processes, adopting an independent commission to review the districts before changing them and make sure that they're not drawn in an excessively partisan way. And then she makes a few recommendations to her readers about how they can be voting activists themselves, And I like one thing in particular that she said, which is she suggests that you engage people as much as you can, but do not assume that all of them will share your passion or your solutions. So be aware that it's not just about telling people this is what I want and this is how it's going to be. The goal is to get other people invested and to find a mutual solution that combines the interests of many different players. She also talks a little bit in a section that I found interesting about the idea of a swing voter. The swing voter, or someone who is likely to vote but goes back and forth between which party they tend to vote for, is a coveted voter by both political parties. And she received some criticism from her own party for targeting not just the swing voters in the gubernatorial election, but also other groups, such as people who have not voted in many years. The idea being that, to put it in my own words, today's non-voters or today's maybe voters, or even today's voters who are definitely going to vote for your candidate, may end up being tomorrow's swing voters. So you need to engage all of them and make sure that everyone's concerns are heard. Abrams then talks about a few additional topics that are related to the idea of voting, but also at the intersection of other political ideas. She talks about the idea of identity politics, which isn't something that I knew a whole lot about, but to put it in a very simple sense is the idea that voters are looking for someone who understands their personal experiences, whether you're a white working class male or a black single parent mother, finding people who will stick up for the ideas that are most relevant to you personally, rather than some more abstract ideal embodied by the party. And I'm probably not doing this idea justice because it's not something that I know a whole lot about, but Abrams argues that this is an idea that has been condemned by a lot of people, but she highly supports it both as a political strategy and as a way to make sure that everyone is represented in America's democracy. She also talks about populism for a while. Populism is also an idea that I'm not super familiar with. She talks about its origins in the Know Nothing Party and the Greenbacks, which I think were at the end of the 19th century. And she talks about William Jennings Bryan, a famous populist, and his Cross of Gold speech. I learned about this in history class, but never really understood what it meant. And to, again, probably give an overly simplistic representation of how she puts it, she talks about how populism, which advocates for the working class, but often especially for working class whites, has been traditionally at odds with progressive movements to help minorities and other discriminated against groups, even though they do, on the surface, share a foundation in the idea of improving things for working class and disadvantaged people. And in fact, she also expresses pretty serious concerns about populism when it supports democracy as a means to install a leader who will then undermine the principles of democracy in itself, such as voting rights, which she argues is what Trump and the Republican Party have been doing. So this last part of the book focuses more on her own political views and the current political situation in the United States leading up to the 2020 election. She also talks about her experiences learning about the U.S.'s foreign relations and how originally this wasn't a topic that she found particularly interesting or inspiring, but she now understands within the lens of voting rights and supporting democratic rights and principles in the U.S. If we in the U.S. are to be seen as credible by other countries, including ones where we're trying to encourage democracy, then we better be doing a good job sticking up for democratic ideals ourselves, which, as she's argued throughout the book, is something that we are not doing a great job of right now. She wraps it up with a section on COVID and the current administration's response to COVID, which, although I agree with it in many ways, was not really the most interesting part of this book to me, and seemed to me like a larger picture in the kind of closing message, which is to get out and vote yourself in the coming election, whatever that may be, whenever you might be reading it or watching this video. So I'll just say that I liked the book. I found it worthwhile, particularly that first half. I learned a lot about the issues regarding voting rights in the United States and where Abrams identifies that there is still progress to be made. And just to put in my 2 cents, I totally agree that there is progress to be made. And I also agree with what she said about how this really is an important issue in how we're viewed by other foreign countries as well. If we're to be taken seriously as a democracy, we need to uphold the values of democracy in a way that goes beyond just serving our own party. So worth a read if you get a chance. And also, if you haven't voted already, I encourage you to go and vote or make a voting plan in the next election, whenever that may be. Bye, and happy reading.